Hello, welcome to this critical examination of the Steamworld series of games. Steamworld is a franchise created and developed by the Gothenburg-based Swedish game studio Image & Form, founded and led by a man with an Icelandic name that nobody can pronounce. So I decided to give my resident Icelandic person a call to sort it out. Hallå, Island. Hur uttalar man detta namnet?
This is Brian Sigurdsson.
Oh. It's a franchise that has progressively risen to increasing prominence on the indie game scene. A lot of that prominence is down to its unconventional approach to differences between games within one and the same franchise. The first game, Steamworld Dig, is a comparatively small game but also a well-focused one. Steamworld Heist, the second game in the franchise, is a product first and a game second, but also speaks volumes about what we can expect from Image & Form as a creative entity. Lastly, the third game in the series, Steamworld Dig 2, is their magnum opus and combines everything done previously in the series but ramped up to fresh proportions. This is going to be part critical examination of each game in order, but also an examination of Image & Form as they present themselves through their games at each one's release. Consequently, you can use the timestamps in the description below to navigate to the different sections of the video. Thank you for taking the time to be here, and I hope you enjoy this. The first Steamworld Dig tips its hand in its official subtitle, A Fistful of Dirt, which makes the promise of nothing more or less than taking the first step towards something. On one level, it promises the game will thematically revolve around the first step of any mining endeavor, but on a meta level, it also speaks of a company taking the first step toward building an independent IP and franchise. After having played through the franchise, it's obviously well earned. What's so impressive about the game is how the theme is operating on every level simultaneously, aesthetically, systemically, and mechanically. On a narrative level, it's an exploration of our romantic ideas of mining, but filtered through the much more informed and cynical steampunk aesthetic. Mining at its core is a story about self-improvement, and the steampunk setting allows for a skeptic reading of that romanticism. On a systemic level, the themes are operating in the upgrade system, the satisfying progression from area to area, and the fact that the more a player progresses, the more advanced, expensive, and dangerous tools are required to deal with the increasingly perilous environments. Mechanically, the game has a clever way of puzzles being dynamically created by the player's digging activity. The idea that rears its head is the romantic ideal of self-improvement and how a person's station in life is their own responsibility, something when examined closely is, of course, an illusion. Taking the first step on a big undertaking is inherently riskful, because you can never know what is further, or indeed furthest, down the road. Interestingly, in Steamworld Dig, this is relevant on the level of the game as well as the meta level of a developer setting out to take on the responsibility of its own franchise. The story of the game is about the conceptually nonsensical idea of transcending downward. It starts with the steambot Rusty coming to Tumbleton, a small mining town in an unknown and unimportant desert in search of his uncle, who has given him the deeds to the Tumbleton mine. Rusty immediately takes up the pickaxe and starts to dig in search of what happened to his uncle, and to answer the question that is apparent to everybody in town: what is so special about this mine? When Rusty arrives in Tumbleton, the town exists in a state of being before the gold rush. Nobody has taken the time and effort to fulfill or even recognize the potential in the mine. And so Rusty takes the first fistful of dirt and discovers that the minerals in the mine are valuable resources that allow him to expand his mining operation. Businesses start cropping up in town, drawn to the possibilities of value. Alongside Rusty's discovery of this, however, he also discovers that the real potential of mining goes beyond finance. The real potential, that which will affect the world in the long run, is discovering the past encapsulated within the earth. First, Rusty discovers from the past a trove of tools that make him a better miner and a better steambot, the upgrades. Second, Rusty discovers the lost world of the irradiated remains of a dying humanity. It begs the question of which pasts, plural, might be found in even deeper parts. The further Rusty goes, the more dangerous his environments become and the more powerful he becomes. The pasts of Steamworld, it turns out, are dangerous. On the deepest level, Rusty finds the world of Vectron, a mysterious high-tech world which was previously thought to be full of lava and molten rock. Here Rusty finds his two final upgrades, a powerful mineral detector and a double jump, which are clearly Voltron technology. These upgrades only foreshadow what is to come though, as Rusty finds Voltbot at the bottom. The robot wants to rule the world, and it's clearly related to whatever the terrible facts are of the fate which befell the humans, and he makes Rusty a proposition: to transcend himself by merging with Voltbot to rule the world. Rusty resists and defeats Voltbot, but as he does so he's turned an electric blue, and the townsfolk of Tumbleton can be seen celebrating him having become deified. Through his mining endeavors, Rusty has become a god. The only one who isn't convinced is the steambot Dorothy, and why Rusty turns blue and is seen walking ominously through the desert on the victory screen is never really explained, but as Voltbot rightly pointed out, Rusty was already prepared to merge with him. He is, after all his upgrades, more a part of Voltron than he is of the steambot world. Compared to everybody else, he's a superhero. The past that Rusty discovered in the mines have terrifying implications about what the world they live in is like. Rusty has transcended in the eyes of the townfolk on the surface, but he didn't realize what the inherent problem with the romantic idealization of mining transcending downward is. The further down he dug himself, the longer the journey back to the location of his transcendent status becomes. The game's systemic elements also communicate with the themes explored in this narrative. The most obvious thing is the already mentioned upgrades found in Vectron. They're only relevant to the story if the player considers how advanced their look and function is compared to the previously found upgrades. But where the game really captures the uneasy relationship between the romantic ideal and the reality of mining is in the incredibly satisfying progression from area to area. Every transition into a new area is a mix between "oh crap, what fresh hell is this?" and "I do wonder what I'll find though." So mining in the age of the gold rush was, in retrospect, absolutely insane. You were as like to simply die in a cave-in as you were having your limbs smashed by your mining partners. Mining business leaders added to the danger by making sure that teams working together spoke different languages in order to avoid having their workforce organize and start making demands. But the allure of treasure and moving up in life, represented systemically in the game by the upgrade system and loop, is ever present alongside that danger. And you never know, the strata of rock may once, as it had in Rusty's world, have encapsulated a forgotten piece of the past. Of course, the game exists more on the romantic spectrum of how you can construe the idea of mining the earth, simply because it has to be fun to play. The progression from area to area has to be good in order to convey the idea, but it is good because the developers have chosen a genre, Metroidvania, which is all about pacing, and done a good job with having the player access a new area just at the point where the previous area is getting tedious. Another systemic aspect of how the game puts the theme at the forefront is requiring the player to go back into previous areas and destroy 3 generators, one for each area, powering Voltbot's cooling systems. This has 2 purposes. First, it gives the player one last look at all the areas and see how far they've come, and second, it gives the player a nice power trip after the comparatively difficult Vectron area. The thing that tips the game in the romantic direction is how smooth it all operates. The pacing is perfect, it allows the player to reflect and to feel powerful at the right times. And I also appreciate the game having the confidence to be subtle about its thematic tensions and interests. A nice touch at the end of the game is that the main menu turns an electric sci-fi blue, where it was previously a red sand western theme. It signals both Rusty's transcendence, but also the darkness that is inherent to it, all by simply changing the aesthetic elements of the systems underpinning the game. There are 2 major areas where the game allows the mechanics to communicate with the higher level themes, the mechanics of mining and the mechanics of combat. The clever thing about the mining mechanics is how it organically creates puzzles, the responsibility of which rests solely on the player. Every time you dig the wrong tile and disaster ensues, you have only yourself to blame. Every time you dig yourself into a pit together with an enemy, you have only yourself to blame. Every time you dig yourself too deep to get that mineral, you have only yourself to blame, and you can almost always find a way around the problem you created if you really want to. The simplicity of the puzzles that generate from player activity is offset by the responsibility resting on the player and not the developer, and their repetitiveness is offset by just how many times you can dig yourself into the same damn conundrum before you learn to stop. On another level, this concept feeds into the mining fantasy. In real-life mining, you can be sure that digging here first and there second is massively different from the other way around. Mining as an operation requires foresight, planning, and most of all knowledge. This knowledge, of course, derives from the mistakes both you and others have made in the past. Like in Steamworld Dig though, many failures can precede cognizance of a problem. Unfortunately, on the combat side, the mechanics of it are best described as coincidental. All the main combat tools, the pickaxe, the steam punch, and the dynamite,
I will remember you.
are all first and foremost mining tools. The fact that they're able to hurt enemies as well is more or less coincidental. At first I thought this as a negative, underdeveloped aspect of the game, but the more I think about it, it appears as a point all on its own. Rusty is simply woefully unprepared for what he actually unleashes at the bottom of the mine. It was thought in Tumbleton that the depth of Vectron was simply a level of molten rock, simply more valuable materials to acquire under even more dangerous circumstances. It speaks to how unprepared and ill-equipped the people in the age of the gold rush were for the march of industrialism and big capital. From the earth, they brought back a world in which we still struggle to find our way, and as such, with these 2 mechanic communications with the larger themes, image and form are able to inform it from bottom to top with the dangers of not knowing the full extent of what you're getting into when you take that first fistful of dirt.
Piper Faraday, notorious smuggler and occasional pirate, is having a rough time.
The follow-up, Steamworld Heist, would turn out to be something much more comfortable as a product than as a game. Sacrificing some of the first game's laser focus in an all-consuming ambition to resist expectations, Heist is a fantastic product first and foremost for its creator. The question for us becomes, is it worth it? The major problem with the game is an ongoing crisis about what it wants to be, the result of which is a non-committal attitude to its ideas and concepts. This is most obvious in its relationship to its heist theme, but is ultimately a problem that permeates the length of the game. The second big problem is unbalanced gameplay. which manifests in the random level generation, the weapons and specifically weapon types, and the relationship between offensive and defensive strategies. As a product, however, Heist is an astounding success because it effectively doubles the base from which Image and Form can build a franchise in the future by expanding it horizontally instead of vertically. But in doing so, the game exposes itself as having value mostly as a business decision, albeit with the alluring promise of adding artistic potential to the company's future ventures. The Heist theme is supposed to be the context in which the game takes place, aesthetically, systemically, and mechanically, but the game struggles to commit to the idea. The idea is that you and your crew board an enemy spacecraft, steal a bunch of their stuff while avoiding danger, escape the conflict, and leave them dumbfounded. In some ways this fantasy is fulfilled, but sometimes it's only done in theory and sometimes not at all. Something every player will realize quickly is that there's no way to know where to go when you've boarded a ship. This is frustrating but admittedly thematically appropriate. However, while the mechanics of moving from room to room are unproblematic, problems appear when it comes to the idea of planning, something integral to the idea of a heist. The game recognizes its importance but handles it clumsily. In a breaking and entering situation, you'd be an idiot to going completely blind, so the game gives you clues in the mission description about what you can expect. The problem is that these are often too vague to give you any real sense of what to expect, and it speaks to the game's inability to systemize the thematics of the heist. Most levels are laid out around a certain theme. Get in and get out quickly, steal all the loot, eliminate all the enemies, and so on. So let's take the early game mission Beat the Brute as an example. Your objectives are as follows. Gather outside the bridge, eliminate the Crusher, evacuate. The mission description reads, since no decent or indecent cowbot dare venture into the colony as it is, someone has to stop this brutal Crusher. As the player boards the ship, everything seems more or less like a normal mission. You start to slowly move throughout the ship, making sure to pick up loot and not enter rooms at a strategic disadvantage in terms of placement and turns left on each character. Before the player knows though, there are turrets everywhere, the alarm system has escalated to level 3, and each group of reinforcements contains an entire room's worth of enemies, and they spawn roughly every turn. Little does the player know, as they're slowly dying painfully on this first attempt, that the intended strategy is to make it to the bridge as soon as possible, then defeat the boss, and then evacuate. There's nothing in these mission objectives that suggests the urgency of reaching the bridge, and this could easily be solved by contextualizing the mission better in this description. Another example of this is the mid-game mission The Average Escape, where the player boards a ship only to be told that none of the enemies aboard have guns. The player is tasked with reaching the exit through exclusively melee-type enemies. Now the worst part of this one is that withholding this information from the player is intended. You're meant to not know this before boarding. The result will likely be that the player is unprepared, and at that point what you have as a developer is simply a bad idea for a scenario. It's a scenario based on punishing a player for a situation you've put them in. Ultimately, instead of making planning a part of this heist game, the player is often left guessing with grossly insufficient information how to approach a mission. Another idea that belongs in the heist fantasy the game fails to commit to is the alarms, and this is problematic in two ways. One, they don't make any sense, and two, they have mechanically been done much better in other games. So let's start with the mechanics. The idea of the alarm is to keep players from turtling, to be overly defensive and slow. But comparing Heist's way of doing it to the way XCOM Enemy Within does it explains why it doesn't work in Heist. In XCOM, the resources players can retrieve on the map are something to strive toward, not run away from. If you don't get them, you lose out, but you won't fail the mission. In Heist, the system works in the opposite way. Instead of something to strive toward, Heist gives the player something they need to avoid. But as I played the game, I realized that this is an unfair connection. Where XCOM is a game about being invaded, Heist is a game where you act as invader. So, fine, the system is appropriately more punishing in Heist. But that brings us to the second problem. It just doesn't make any sense, and what's even worse is how there's an opportunity to have it make sense just sitting there in plain sight. The alarm system doesn't make sense if you think about where the enemies are coming from or how many are spawning in. At level 3 you can easily end up with more enemies spawned from the alarm system than was on the entire level originally, and the level 3 spawns contain some of the most brawny enemies in the game. Why weren't they defending the spaceship from the start? Why are they in other parts of the spaceship only to appear later on when there's a bigger threat? At level 1, it's less jarring because it makes sense that some stragglers are simply late to the battle, but at level 3, it becomes silly. Where the game's identity crisis rears its head is that a solution is right under everybody's noses. All 3 enemy types, Scrappers, Royalists, Vectron bots, possess Vectron technology able to create new bots. Right there, the game has a narrative get out of jail free card that it just never uses. In short, the game fails to commit to its idea of enemy security measures by leaving the alarm system, with its thematically resonant, punishing nature, uncontextualized, unrealistic, and jarring, even though a great explanation is right there. There are other scattered examples of how the game refuses to commit to its own concepts. First, let's take a look at another example in the Brawl Club mission. You get it after speaking to a bot in a bar who tells you there's a nearby brawl with a prize pool. You board the ship only to find Royalists and Scrappers already engaged in brawling, with guns. So questions ensue. Why are the Royalist soldiers interested in the competition, and why are they allowed to partake? Am I on a side, and if so, which? Are there no rules to this competition, and is anyone able to enter at any time? Doesn't the word brawl suggest a more fisticuffs type of thing? These questions are never answered. Instead, you just kill both Scrappers and Royalists while they fight each other before the game proclaims you as the winner, and the rest plays out like any other mission. Second, the solo missions, of which I believe there is one per map. Instinctively, the idea is bad. It removes almost every tactical option that comes with having several characters with different strengths and weaknesses. But as with the alarms, it would be okay if there was context, if there was a reason you needed to do the mission solo. But instead, the developers have just decided that it's a one-bot mission and doesn't bother to give a reason in any of them. As a result, they're an unwelcome chore. Third, it almost seems like the developers themselves are kind of losing faith in their game as the third act gets going. The late-game mission Tower of Production was literally 3 rooms, with only one being even remotely interesting. But more than that, this mission ties into the bigger problem of non-commitment. The reason the crew goes to the tower is to sever Vectron's connection between its robots. This too begs a few questions. Why is this communications tower so poorly guarded? It has the potential to be a comment on the arrogance of Vectron, but again, like the alarms, the game doesn't pick up on its own cues. What's more is how the game makes the point in the next mission, Dazed and Confused, that cutting communication sends Vectron and its security measures into disarray. Later on in the story though, you disable the central communications device, but this has no effect. Instead, Vectron ships are as alert as ever and your enemies seem unaffected. After destroying the first device, Wonky, our pilot, even explicitly comments that shutting it down should affect Vectron. He's right, it should. The same phrase can be applied to every critique of the game I've brought up here. Planning should be possible before going on a heist. There should be an explanation for why so many enemies join the fight at such a late stage. There should be rules to the brawl competition. There should be a reason why other crew members can't join solo missions. Ultimately, as a game, Steamworld Heist comes across as underdeveloped and inexplicably filled with these should statements from start to finish.
Construct a new day from the bad.
Let's talk about the other cluster of problems, the unbalanced gameplay. The most unfortunate example is how the weapon types aren't balanced against each other. The sharpshooter weapon type with its aiming laser, it's virtually always the best option. On the screen now, all weapon types from the same tier are displayed. You can probably tell that the idea for differentiating the weapon types is here. Assault weapons are supposed to be better at close range, handguns are supposed to sacrifice aim for damage, and heavy weapons are strong because of their splash damage. There's even an alternate sharpshooter weapon type, sacrificing movement before shooting for higher damage. The problem is simple, they're not equivalent. Let's use the normal sharpshooter as a base. It does 10 damage. As for handguns, the laser aiming is taken away for 1 extra damage. It's not even close to compensation, and you're much better off equipping, for instance, a flanker class with a normal sharpshooter for the versatility of not having to get close for every shot. The assault weapon also gets 1 damage, but is offset both by requiring you to get close as well as the unpredictable spread of the weapon. The alternate sharpshooter loses the ability to move before shooting, but gains 1 damage and 50% higher critical chance. Again, the ability to not move is not offset by those values, since the way levels are laid out seldom allows you to find one good sniping position to stick with. The best option is the heavy RPG, which is able to damage several enemies at once. But their usefulness is stifled by their unpredictable bouncing, which can end up hurting your own team members. A misplaced rocket can devastate an entire mission.
I will remember.
Ultimately, in general, the player is penalized for using anything other than the sharpshooter that lets you move before shooting, because its aiming aid ability is incredibly useful in terms of predictability. Secondly, the random level generation works by partially randomizing how levels get constructed before you enter them. Some parts of levels are always the same, but the things in between those static parts vary, and it's almost never a positive thing. Often when the player fails, it's not exclusively their fault, but rather the fault of random elements, the level generation or the enemy spawns, having the odds stacked ever so slightly against them. Let's put it this way, if you're randomly favored, you get away with a few mistakes. If you're randomly unfavored, you're unlikely to get by unless every action you take is absolutely optimal. Of course, every action can't be optimal since you can't know enemy locations and spawn points nor level layout in advance. For example, the difference between having a room generate with no cover on the side of your entry point and having lots of cover on that side is massive. Using random level generation requires a deft hand as well as a purpose. In games using it successfully, like Minecraft, it's used to create replayability to make sure that whenever a level is generated, it will create many interesting exploration opportunities. In Steamworld Heist though, its only function is to somewhat offset the fact that a player will have to replay at least a few of the levels because of the unfair mission design. But at that point, you're solving a problem by adding a new one, which is very inelegant. It also doesn't add anything, because the player is still functionally doing the same things in the newly generated levels. Which brings me to my next point, the lack of balance between offense and defense. Because of how the alarm system works, it's always better to be offensive rather than defensive. Firstly, there are very few defensive options. Guarding doesn't have any defensive benefits beyond breaking line of sight, which is unpredictable. There's no half cover or full cover strategic option. There are also few defensive character abilities, but even though those options are there, they aren't really viable beyond creating a diversion in order to be even more aggressive with your other team members. Every turn the player isn't spending either moving toward the level's goal or shooting enemies dead brings them closer to the inevitable Alarmageddon. The end result of all this is a game where the player is always doing the same version of the same thing. That thing is boarding, locating enemies, finding cover, shooting, and rushing against the mission timer. And since some tools are so superior to others, there is little variation in approach.
Goodbye, it was nice to know you. How I find myself without hello. Goodbye, I'm rather crazy, and I never thought I was crazy.
With all that said, there are definitely nuggets of excellence sprinkled throughout the game. The boss fights are some of the best I've seen in a while, and any player who likes those especially will likely feel justified in playing the length of the game. The soundtrack is divided between the ambient level tracks and the fantastic songs recorded by the steampunk band Steam-Powered Giraffe. These songs are often used at the end of bosses to instill a celebratory tone, and I don't think I've ever seen it done this well before. In general, the game is rescued by the kooky charm of the steampunk world Image and Form have quickly built up for their franchise. It's a compelling world with a compelling overarching narrative across titles, and there's a lot of humor in the dialogue, even though I would prefer if the game didn't do this. One line? Did you really just make me walk across the entire ship for the most generic line I've ever read?
Brian Sirgerson.
Huh? In a Nintendo Everything interview from 2016,
Brian Sirgerson
expresses gratitude that Steamworld Heist did quite a bit better in terms of sales than Steamworld Dig did. But he also mentions the tough decisions made in order for it to be a success. One of these, according to him, was to release it in December 2015 instead of in the early spring of 2016. The fact that a business decision like that took priority over artistic ambition explains why the criticisms I have brought up seem to have very simple answers. The heist elements of gameplay is nominally there, but too much information is withheld to satisfy players who want to plan and execute in style. Why alarms function in the brutal way they do is never addressed by the game, which another few months would probably solve with one more iteration of polish. And the myriad of small problems plaguing the player's relationship to the game's levels all have simple countermeasures like another line of dialogue contextualizing what the game is trying to do. It's easy to imagine these things rationalized away to meet the earlier deadline, because they don't necessarily need to be there, but they certainly should. It's also easy to see a world where the developer bit off slightly more than they could chew, with developing such a complex genre as turn-based strategy, not having the required expertise to handle random level generation or balancing weapons and offensive and defensive abilities. There's no doubt, however, that Steamworld Heist was a masterstroke for Image and Form as a company, as the game was not only popular on its own but also drove word of mouth and people's admiration for taking the plunge into doing something so different from what their previous success consisted of. It remains to be seen if the promise of increased artistic potential would be fulfilled by later games from the studio. Spoiler alert, it was. The fact that Steamworld Dig 2 knows itself better than either of the earlier games is apparent the moment the game is started, with a theme song reminiscent of the title track from Stranger Things. The game shares a lot of its DNA with Stranger Things once you think about it. Your friend, Rusty from the first game, has gone missing, your character finds an unlikely, mysterious companion that aids her on her journey, and there's the theme of good guys gone bad in the plot twist surrounding the Shiners. What it shares most with Stranger Things, though, is having one foot in the past and one in the present, and it handles both of these aspects with deftness. In retrospective comparison, the first game comes out being much more rooted in its 2D platforming legacy than it did on its own, and not in a good way. With Steamworld Dig 2, Image and Form has seemingly realized that old-school 2D platformers had some, by modern standards, glaring problems. The most jarring transition from modern games to an old-school platformer is how slow and clunky to control they are. Another aspect, one that the first game inherited, is how their combat is often coincidental. Take Mario's jump as an example and consider that the only reason it hurts enemies is because the designers decided to make it do that in addition to its traversal function. The game also realizes that the Metroidvania design the first game only managed to hint at was its arguably most interesting aspect, and it develops this concept both in terms of mechanics, systems, and level design. It's easy to accuse Steamworld Heist of being a cold, calculated business strategy, but in retrospect, with Steamworld Dig 2 in the rearview mirror, it appears more as a fruitful pause allowing the sequel to Dig to refine its concept over a longer period of time. The key difference in the moment-to-moment gameplay is speed. Steamworld Dig 2 is a much snappier game than the first. Dorothy, your new character, is a nimbler Steambot than Rusty ever was, and while it could be argued that Steambots probably shouldn't be this quick, the first game never explicitly made that connection, so it's a suspension of disbelief with disproportionately positive effects. In other words, it's an aesthetic compromise well worth its small price. In addition to the general nimbleness of the main character, new upgrades like the hookshot and the jetpack allow movement that was simply impossible in the much more grounded gameplay of the first game. Before you know it, you're zipping across previously unthinkable distances with the first one and clearing vast abysses of lava with the second, whereas the major traversal upgrade in the first game was the simple double jump acquired late in the game. Another way the game's relationship to the speed of modern games is apparent is the different sensibility brought to the level design. The first game had you explore 3 areas, one after the other, with similar sizes and pacing beats. The second game, however, has you explore 3 areas, above the wall, below the wall, and the Eastern Temple at a brisk pace before taking you to an interlude in a now dilapidated and frankly terrifying Vectron. After Vectron, the game opens up the previously separate areas and transforms what they are in the player's mind into one large interconnected area. In addition to this, the Mushroom Poison Death Trap Cave, a previously tiny transitory area, is transformed into an entire new level of its own. Lastly, the rate at which you upgrade your character has been drastically increased by way of the newly introduced COG system. The COG system, beyond giving the player more options, also has the added benefit of making upgrading less of a predetermined track than it was in the first game. The only option the player had in the first game was which upgrades to take first, but in the second one, you can switch cogs out at will with a range of ambitions. You can be good at everything, you can adapt to a specific situation, and you can synergize different cog upgrades with one another, and so on. It's somewhat ironic that this second game, which levels are designed with a much heavier hand, the first game's levels were at least partly procedurally generated, is so varied compared to the first. It stands as a testament to the fact that procedural generation doesn't lead to interesting gameplay, good game design does. The modern speed of Steamworld Dig 2 also stands as a testament, but to a hard-earned lesson. emulating a previously existing design is only a good idea when it adds something to a game. Otherwise, it's best left in the past. The same philosophy can be seen in the game's approach to combat, which is now a part of the game on every level. The most apparent difference is that the player now has more or less dedicated combat tools, and if they aren't dedicated as such, they can at least be turned into dedicated weapons. In addition to the pickaxe, the player now has a pressure bomb, a jet engine, and a hookshot, which can all be used in combat. The pickaxe can be upgraded to increase its reach, the lack of which is what made it awkward in the first game. The pressure bomb can be turned into what is effectively a grenade launcher. The jet engine can be turned into a fireball, and the hookshot works as both an offensive tool and an effective defensive escape mechanism. Where the first game's tools felt designed with digging in mind first and combat second, the player's tools in the second game feel balanced between the two, and more so since the player can choose themselves which tools they feel are best suited to what job. What I found most impressive about the transition between games in terms of combat, however, is how the game introduces its new philosophy to the player. The first thing the player does in the game is fight a fairly easy boss. This communicates the stronger emphasis on combat to players in a way that conditions returning players without getting in the way of new players who have less solidified expectations. But what's even more elegant is how you no longer level up through selling items, but instead through the combat. Each time you level up, you get a 5% increase to the value of what you sell. This communicates early and clearly to players that combat is going to be important throughout the game, and seamlessly integrates the expanded combat mechanics into already familiar systems. The fact that Steamworld Dig 2 integrates this into what was already there in the first game makes it clear that old games didn't have this problem because they were intentionally designed that way, but rather because of the limitations of their time. A limitation there is little reason bringing into a modern reimagining. The last way the game develops from the first game is also the most complex to discuss. Its Metroidvania design. There's a reason the genre is as respected as it is, and it's the same reason games attempting it often fall short. Turns out it's really difficult to make something where everything is connected. Shout out to my boy God, he did a pretty good job. In Steamworld Dig 2, the complexity is compounded by how well the mechanics of its Metroidvania design are integrated with its systems. The mechanics are comparatively easy to put into words. The levels open up as one large connected space as the player acquires more powerful tools, and previously inaccessible areas now become available to the player who has the urge to explore. The trick the genre needs to pull off, though, is akin to a good plot twist. The developers need to make sure that the player can notice things that will later become available, but that they generally don't. If it's too obvious, the player will know precisely which locations will open up from which upgrades, and the excitement and mystery about getting that next upgrade is lost. Conversely, if the player never notices an area can be reached, if they could only find a way, the player will be confused about what the game expects them to do every time a new upgrade is acquired. In Steamworld Dig 2, I mostly had no idea so many areas were there I hadn't previously noticed. I'm sure you can schematize its levels in a similar fashion to this, but I certainly won't try. What really impressed me though was how well the game handles this aspect. Now, the first thing to notice is how it engages in precisely the type of semi-extra-diegetic communication that was lacking in Steamworld Heist. After Vectron, the game tells the player in the language of its world that in addition to just going back to previously explored areas, the new tools will likely let them discover areas they didn't even know were there. It sets the player off on a multi-phase quest across the already explored western and eastern temples, as well as the new Snail Kingdom of Suffering, which is actually called Vijaro, but I call him like I see him, and it lets them know what to expect from the experience, without breaking the fourth wall of the game's world. Steamworld Heist would just ignore that. Now, the second important thing to notice is how the XP system has been retooled to make going back to previous areas as lucrative as it was hours ago, since the player is likely several levels and 5% increases of selling power stronger. In addition, the cog system is used in order to further increase the value of low-level minerals. All in service of the idea that the game should be explored as one entire progressively opened area made up of previously separated levels, as long as the player uses the correct tools for the job. This is expert Metroidvania design, and underestimating how much work the seemingly simple connections between areas, spatial as well as mechanic and systemic, would be doing Image and Form a disservice. Steamworld Dig 2 is a thoughtful, inspiring modernization of an old genre, and it wears this on its sleeve the same way the inspirations for Stranger Things are crystal clear. Image and Form have perceptively looked at the old school design philosophy of the games that inspired the first one and said, "We can do this a lot better nowadays though." In identifying the slowness of similar games, they have not only shown that you don't have to include every aspect of what inspired you, but also that one of the most popular modern technologies, procedural generation, isn't always a good answer to a problem. They show us, through the refinement of its combat mechanics and systems, that the way older games worked was largely due to technological constraints, and that we can and should do better now. They also took one of the most notoriously complex genres and put their own twist on it with what was already there in their first game, albeit in a modified form. Ultimately, it retroactively recasts the underdeveloped Steamworld Heist as a monumental success by not only allowing Steamworld Dig 2 the time it needed to gestate into what it became, but also to expand what the company is and can become in the future. It seems certain that Image and Form will go on to keep doing as impressive work as they do in Steamworld Dig 2. Of course, there is one game in the Steamworld franchise that hasn't been discussed. In 2010, Image and Form made the first Steamworld game, Steamworld Tower Defense. Image and Form, on closer inspection, is a much older company than they might seem at first glance. They too have one foot in the past and one in the present. I won't be talking about Steamworld Tower Defense for two reasons. First, and practically, I haven't been able to get a hold of it since I don't own any DS consoles. Secondly, and more importantly, questions arise in delineating where Image and Form became the developer that it is now. The three games on this list are picked out because they represent so well the development of the studio within the constellation of the market that we are currently in. The company was founded in 1997, and that means it is now older than the indie game market it is both developing and changing. To me, the most interesting thing about Image and Form is how they're having one foot in the past and one in the present is seemingly the thing that also allows them to put one confident foot into the future in terms of the indie game market in general. When Steamworld Tower Defense released in 2010, the market for games of that size and scope looked dramatically different than it does today. The PlayStation Vita hadn't been released, the PlayStation Portable was effectively dead, and the Nintendo DS didn't really have any serious competition to consider. Braid had been released to critical acclaim a mere 2 years earlier, and the indie game boom the game seemed to promise was only beginning to pick up serious steam. Big hardware developers didn't know how important smaller games developed by smaller studios would be in the future. They relied on in-house developers and on big-name third-party developers to make as many games as they had always done, without realizing that especially the second part of that ecosystem was about to change. It's impossible to overstate the effect the Nintendo Wii had on the size of the video game market. It brought so many new people into the medium. But instead of making more games, big publishers like Ubisoft, EA, and what is now Activision Blizzard went down the path of making fewer games, funded by monetizing structures with better margins. This, however, also opened up a space in the market for developers like Image and Form, and if there was one question I would ask
Brian Sigerson
if I had the opportunity, it would be whether he considers the studio's comparative veterancy one of the reasons it has done so well in this new climate, because I believe it is. When Steamworld Tower Defense was picked up for the Nintendo DSiWare platform in 2010, Image and Form had been an award-winning studio producing edutainment titles for over 10 years. Now consider Indie Game the Movie. In it, we follow 3 developers who have all had very different fates in the years which followed. Jonathan Blow ascended into some sort of godhood. Team Meat is all but forgotten, even if Edmund Macmillan himself went on to make the stupidly successful Binding of Isaac. And Phil Fish, well, let's not go down that rabbit hole again. The point is that, as businesses, they were fresh-faced kids. The film especially describes an underdog story with characters succeeding in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Image and Form in comparison seem ancient and rooted. They have staying power. In the years following Steamworld Tower Defense, the studio has only become bigger and badder, and I can't help to think that the ability to keep a footing outside of whatever current shifts are going on is a big contributor to this. As Steamworld Dig releases, the market is roughly what we see now, and the way I see it, this is where the story starts proper. The first Dig, though, is still a product rooted in the past rather than the present of video game design, but as we've seen, it was only a first investigative fistful of dirt. It asks, maybe you guys would like something like this, because it toes the line of hope with its mix of fear and possibility. It's undoubtedly an excellent game, but it's careful about the claim it stakes. With Steamworld Heist, the studio expands their claim. The game says we're here, we're staying, and we're going to do what we feel is right. Now, I don't like it nearly as much as the first one as a game, but as a product, it demands respect up front. Where the first game is a suggestion, the second one is a promise. And so the third game, Steamworld Dig 2, in that sequence is a slam dunk fulfillment of that promise. It's got more creative power as a game than previous games put together, but as a product too, it's simultaneously as bold, if not bolder, than Heist. As a product, it stakes a claim on not only the past and present, but also the future. If I were to guess, Steamworld Dig 2 is like a pinnacle of the current indie game market, which is in the process of changing, and Image and Form are an excellent example of how this is happening. The indie game market grew up on the PC, with many of the prominent developers growing up on the Flash game scene, and as the market moves away from that paradigm, and it is, developers like Image and Form are picking up the slack. Steamworld Dig 2 has sold 10 times more on the Nintendo Switch than it has on Steam, and that's important evidence to a discussion that has been going on for years. Last year,
Brian Sigerson
was featured in Jim Sterling's Jimquisition episode Post Direct Steam is Shittier Than Ever, and quoted saying,
He told me both Steam and mobile were very crowded, too crowded in fact, as the Nintendo Switch and Xbox One seek to curry favour with prominent independent creators and capitalise on Steam's clogged pipeline.
For years, the way Steam works has been a problem for the visibility and discoverability of games like those in the Steamworld franchise. And the problem doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Valve seems more or less uninterested in remedying the problem, but in being so, they're missing something I believe is going to be crucial moving forward. Consumers want these games. and we're going to find them regardless. And developers are going to make these games, and they're going to find ways to sell them regardless. We're just going to find new ways of achieving that consistently. Sure, it's gonna take some time, but it'll happen unless something changes. There are a lot of similarities between how Steam works now and the way Newgrounds worked before indie games exploded into the scene. Steamworld Dig 2 suggests, as a product, that the point of no return has been reached. The 10 times more figure is reported because it's an important signal. In short, Steam is not going to change in time to stop the indie game market spending its adolescence somewhere other than the PC, and in this development the Steamworld franchise and Image and Form show us past, present, and future all at once. The release of Steamworld Tower Defense happened in a world that looked a lot different than it does in 2018. And it stands apart from the story of Image and Form's rise in the indie game space as it is familiar to us now. At the moment of writing this, news has just recently broke that Image and Form have merged with another Gothenburg-based Swedish development studio, Zoink, the creators of Fae, to formalize an already close relationship into the new company Thunderful, and effectively doubling the team size. This can be seen as the end of an era with 3 parts to its story: the foundation of Steamworld Dig, the widening of possibilities with Steamworld Heist, and Steamworld Dig 2 as a claim on a bright future. The amount of time these people have been in the industry, the amount of knowledge and competence brought to the table, has surely been a big contributor to Image and Form's rising popularity and importance, and will undoubtedly be invaluable in the years to come. Thank you for watching.